Long before stone temples were raised or sacred names were carved into wood and bone, there were gods who lived only in breath, in memory, and in the uneasy silence between falling snowflakes. Their names were never written down. They were spoken softly, often only once, then passed from mouth to mouth like a fragile ember carried through a frozen night. And today, most of them are gone, not destroyed, not defeated, but simply forgotten, as if they slipped quietly beneath the snow and chose never to return. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast forest at dusk. The air is cold enough to sting the lungs, and the trees stretch endlessly in every direction, their branches tangled like black veins against a dim sky. There is no road behind you and no certainty ahead. Somewhere in that forest, something watches, not with eyes, perhaps, but with presence, with intention. This is a world the ancient Slav believed they lived in every day, a world where the unseen was never far away, where every sound carried meaning, and where silence itself could be a warning. What if the greatest mythologies in human history were not built on grand monuments or heroic epics, but on fear, endurance, and long winter nights? What if gods were not meant to be admired from afar, but feared, bargained with, and quietly obeyed? Slavic mythology does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with shining palaces in the clouds or perfectly ordered pantheons. Instead, it seeps into the ground, into tree roots, into rivers that freeze solid and thaw again, year after year. It is a mythology shaped not by conquest, but by survival. For centuries, entire communities lived their lives believing that the world around them was alive in ways that could not be seen. The forest was not just a collection of trees. It was a place of memory and danger. The river was not just flowing water. It was a boundary between safety and loss. Even the home itself was never truly empty. Every shadow near the hearth, every unexplained sound at night, carried the possibility that something unseen had entered the room. To the ancient Slavs, the gods are not distant beings ruling from the sky. They were close, uncomfortably close. And yet, when we look back now, there is almost nothing left that speaks clearly in their voice. No single holy book, no official scripture, no agreed-upon version of how the world began or how it would end. What remains are fragments, echoes preserved in folklore, distorted through centuries of retelling, reshaped by fear, faith, and forgetting. It is as if an entire spiritual universe once existed in full color, only to fade slowly into shadow, leaving behind faint outlines that historians still struggle to interpret. This absence is part of what makes Slavic mythology so haunting. It feels like listening for footsteps in an abandoned house, certain that someone was there once, but unsure where they went. Unlike the mythologies that were carefully recorded and preserved by priests or poets, Slavic beliefs were carried by ordinary people, farmers, hunters, mothers, elders. Their gods lived in daily routines, in planting seeds, in waiting for rain, in surviving winters that could swallow entire villages without mercy. These were people who understood that nature did not care about human hope. Crops failed. Children fell ill. Storms arrived without warning. In such a world, belief was not about comfort alone. It was about explanation, control, however fragile. If thunder struck a tree, it meant something. If the harvest failed, someone or something was displeased. The gods were not abstract ideas. They were forces that needed to be acknowledged, respected, and sometimes feared into cooperation. There is something deeply human in this kind of belief. It speaks to a time when the line between imagination and reality was thin, when the unknown was not an intellectual puzzle, but a daily threat. To walk into the forest alone was not bravery. It was risk. To ignore tradition was not rebellion. It was dangerous. Mythology became a way to make sense of a world that did not explain itself. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, those gods began to disappear. Not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse, but quietly. As new beliefs arrived, as new stories replaced old ones, the ancient gods were pushed further back, first into folklore, then into children's stories, and finally into obscurity. Their names survived in distorted forms, their personalities blurred, their meanings misunderstood. Some became demons. Others became fairy tale villains. A few were softened into harmless spirits, stripped of the power they once commanded. What remains today is a mythology that feels incomplete, like a dream remembered only in pieces. And yet, that incompleteness gives it a strange power. Slavic mythology invites us not into a polished narrative, but into an atmosphere, into a feeling, into a world where belief was not neat or orderly, but tangled, contradictory, and deeply personal. As you listen, it is worth letting go of the expectation that everything will fit together perfectly. These stories were never meant to be studied under bright light. They were told in half-darkness, whispered across generations, shaped by fear and hope in equal measure. They were meant to be felt more than understood. In the quiet rhythm of these forgotten gods, there's a reminder of something modern life often forgets, that humans once lived much closer to uncertainty, and that mythology was not entertainment, but a survival tool, a way to explain why winter came, why death lingered, and why the world could feel both sacred and cruel at the same time. So as we begin this journey into the complete history of Slavic mythology, imagine yourself stepping into that ancient forest once more. The snow muffles your footsteps. The air is still. Somewhere beyond the trees, something ancient stirs, not loudly, not urgently, but patiently, waiting to be remembered, even if only for a moment, before slipping back into silence again. The story of Slavic mythology cannot be separated from the land itself, because the land came first, long before the gods were given names, before stories were shaped into rituals and whispered warnings. There were people moving slowly across vast, unsettled spaces. They did not travel as conquerors or empire builders. They traveled because they had to. The earth shifted beneath their feet, climates changed, and survival demanded movement. In this quiet, persistent wandering, the early Slavs began to form a relationship with the world that would shape every belief they later held. They lived in places where the horizon often felt endless and the sky seemed impossibly large. Forests stretched so far that they swallowed sound, light, and direction. Rivers cut to the land like living borders, freezing solid in winter and roaring dangerously in spring. Marshes hid beneath tall grass, and open plains offered no shelter from wind or enemy alike. In such landscapes, nature was not something admired from a distance. It was something that surrounded you completely, something that decided whether you would eat, sleep, or live another season. Unlike civilizations that rose in warmer climates, where agriculture could be carefully planned and cities could grow stable and permanent, the early Slavic world was unpredictable. Winters were long and unforgiving. Summers were brief and precious. A single failed harvest could mean hunger for months. A sudden frost could erase weeks of careful labor overnight. The land taught them early that nothing was guaranteed. Everything had to be earned, and even then, it could be taken away without warning. This uncertainty shaped how the Slavs understood themselves. They were not masters of their environment. They were participants in it. They learned to read subtle signs, the way animals moved before storms, the way rivers sounded beneath thinning ice, the way forests seemed to grow unnaturally quiet before danger. Survival depended on attention, on respect, on humility, and over time, these practical observations slowly blended into something deeper, something sacred. As Slavic communities formed, they remained small, scattered, and closely tied to specific regions. Villages were built where the land allowed it, not where ambition demanded it. Homes were constructed from wood and earth, meant to blend into the environment rather than dominate it. Even the act of building carried awareness. Trees were not cut without thought, and land was not taken without ritual. To disturb the natural order without acknowledgement felt dangerous, as if the land itself might respond. This way of living created a worldview where silence mattered. Long stretches of quiet were common, especially in winter, when snow-dampened sound and darkness arrived early. In that silence, people listened, not just for wolves or weather, but for meaning. A crack in the ice, a sudden gust of wind, an unfamiliar sound in the forest could all feel like messages rather than accidents. When life is lived close to uncertainty, the mind naturally searches for patterns. The early Slavs did not leave behind grand monuments or written declarations of who they were. Their identity was shaped through repetition. Season after season, generation after generation, children learned the rhythms of the land before they learned stories. They learned when to plant, when to gather, when to retreat indoors and wait. Time was not measured by calendars, but by survival cycles. And within those cycles, belief quietly took root. It is important to understand that migration itself became part of Slavic identity. As communities shifted, split, and resettled, they carried not possessions, but knowledge. Stories adapted to new forests, new rivers, new dangers. A spirit that lived in one woodland might change character in another. A god associated with storms might gain new meaning in a region where thunder was rare, but floods were deadly. Mythology remained fluid, shaped by the land it inhabited. This fluidity explains why Slavic mythology never crystallized into a single, unified system. There was no central authority to declare which gods mattered most or which stories were true. Belief remained local, intimate, and flexible. What mattered in one village might be irrelevant in another. And yet, beneath these differences, a shared understanding existed. The world was alive, and humans were not alone within it. Survival in this environment also required cooperation. Villages depended on shared labor, shared knowledge, and shared memory. Isolation was dangerous. This social structure reinforced collective belief. Rituals were not private acts of faith, but communal necessities. When storms came or illness spread, the response was collective. Everyone participated because everyone was vulnerable. In such a setting, mythology functioned as social glue, binding people together through shared explanation and shared hope. The land also taught the Slavs patience. There was no way to rush the seasons or argue with winter. Waiting became a skill, and endurance became a virtue. This patience is reflected in their myths, which often emphasize cycles rather than conclusions. Death is rarely final. Conflict is rarely resolved forever. Everything returns in some form, just as spring follows winter, even after the harshest cold. Over time, as Slavic people spread across Eastern and Central Europe, their relationship with the land continued to evolve. They adapted to mountains, coastlines, plains, and dense forests, carrying the same underlying worldview with them. Wherever they settled, they listened first. They observed. They learned. And then they shaped their beliefs around what they found. This deep attentiveness to place created a mythology that feels grounded and intimate, even centuries later. There is little distance between the human and the divine in Slavic belief. Gods do not live far away in unreachable realms. They exist in storms, in soil, in shadows beneath trees. They are experienced through the senses, not abstractly imagined. When later religions arrived with written doctrines and fixed narratives, they encountered a belief system that was already deeply embedded in daily life. It could not be easily erased because it was not confined to temples or texts. It lived in habits, in instincts, in the way people moved through their environment. Even as names changed and stories were reshaped, the underlying relationship between humans and land remained. Understanding where the Slavs came from means understanding this quiet, enduring connection to place. Their mythology was not invented in isolation. It emerged slowly, shaped by cold nights, uncertain harvests, and a constant awareness that survival was never guaranteed. It was born from listening, to the land, to each other, and to the silence that filled the spaces in between. And in that silence, belief did not shout. It waited. It settled. It became part of how the world was understood, not as something separate from life, but as life itself, unfolding season by season, step by careful step. Before ink ever touched parchment, before sacred words were fixed in place and protected from change, memory was the only sanctuary belief could rely on. For the ancient Slavs, stories did not live in books. They lived in voices, in breath, in the steady rhythm of speech repeated so often that it became as familiar as the sound of wind through trees. To forget a story was to lose a piece of the world itself. And so remembering became a quiet responsibility shared by everyone. In the long evenings, when daylight faded early and the cold pressed close to wooden walls, people gathered near the fire. Flames flickered and shadows stretched across the room, moving like living things. This was a natural setting for storytelling. There were no stages, no performers separated from listeners. The storyteller was simply someone who remembered, someone who carried the past within them and released it slowly, word by word, into the darkness. These stories were never told exactly the same way twice. Each telling shifted slightly, shaped by the mood of the speaker, the needs of the listeners, or the events of the day. A storm outside might make a god seem more dangerous. A good harvest might soften the spirit's temper. This flexibility was not seen as a flaw. It was proof that the story was alive. Fixed word belonged to dead things. Living stories needed to breathe. Memory, in this world, was not passive. It required attention and repetition. Children learned early by listening, sitting quietly while elders spoke. They absorbed rhythms and patterns before they fully understood meaning. Certain phrases were repeated in specific ways, not because they were decorative, but because they made remembering easier. The cadence mattered. The pauses mattered. Silence itself was part of the lesson. There was no sharp line between myth history and instruction. A story about a god might also teach when a plant crops or why certain places should be avoided. A tale about a spirit could explain why fires must be treated with respect or why water should never be wasted. Knowledge and belief were woven together so tightly that separating them would have made both weaker. Because stories were carried by people, they traveled as people traveled. When a family moved to a new settlement, they brought their myths with them. When villages merged or split apart, stories blended, clashed, and changed. Over generations, this created layers of meaning, some old and some newly adapted. A god known by one name in one region might be known by another elsewhere, with slightly different traits. This was not confusion. It was continuity. The act of storytelling was also an act of trust. To speak a story was to place it in the care of others, knowing it would change in their mouths and memories. There was no way to control how it would be retold. And yet, this lack of control was accepted, perhaps even embraced. In a world where nothing stayed the same, belief had to be flexible to survive. Oral tradition also meant that knowledge was selective. Not every story was told to everyone. Some were reserved for certain seasons. Others were whispered only to adults, or only in moments of crisis. There were stories meant to comfort, and others meant to warn. The timing of a story mattered as much as its content. To tell the wrong story at the wrong time could feel dangerous, as if it might invite unwanted attention. Silence, too, had meaning. There were moments when stories stopped, when the fire crackled, and no one spoke. In those pauses, listeners were left alone with their thoughts, their fears, and their imaginations. These quiet spaces allowed stories to sink deeper, to become part of personal memory rather than something merely heard. Without written records, authority did not come from text, but from experience. Elders were respected not because they owned books, but because they remembered more. They had lived through more winters, seen more failures and recoveries. Their voices carried weight because they had endured. When they spoke of gods and spirits, they were not repeating doctrine. They were sharing lived understanding shaped by time. This also meant that belief was closely tied to emotion. Stories were remembered not because they were logical, but because they made people feel something. Fear made a story stick. Wonder made it return. Comfort allowed it to be shared again and again. In this way, mythology became deeply personal. Everyone carried slightly different versions of the same tales, colored by their own experiences. Over time, repetition turned stories into ritual. Certain myths were told every year at the same time, linked to seasons and ceremonies. The telling itself became sacred, a moment when past and present touched. Even if the words changed, the act remained. This continuity created a sense of stability in a world that offered very little of it. Oral memory also left room for forgetting. Some stories faded when they were no longer needed. A spirit associated with a vanished forest might lose relevance when people moved away. A god tied to a forgotten practice might slowly disappear from conversation. Forgetting was not failure. It was adaptation. Mythology shifted to reflect what mattered now, not what had mattered generations before. When writing eventually arrived, it did not capture Slavic mythology as it truly was. It caught it mid-motion, frozen in incomplete forms. Outsiders recorded fragments, often misunderstanding context or reshaping stories to fit their own beliefs. What was written down was not the living tradition, but its shadow. The true mythology had existed in countless voices, most of which were never heard beyond their own villages. This is why Slavic mythology can feel elusive today. It resists clear definition because it was never meant to be fixed. It belonged to the moment of telling, to the warmth of the fire, to the shared breath of speaker and listener. It was shaped by memory, not preservation. And yet, there is something deeply comforting in this fragility. These stories survived not because they were protected, but because they were loved. They were carried through generations by people who believed they mattered, even if they did not fully understand why. In a world without books, memory was sacred, and storytelling was an act of quiet devotion. As the fire burned low and the night stretched on, stories would end not with finality, but with silence. A pause, a moment where the listener was left alone with images and feelings, free to interpret them in their own way. In that silence, beliefs settled gently, becoming part of how the world felt rather than how it was explained. This is a world in which Slavic mythology lived, not on the page, but in the air, passed from voice to voice, shaped by time, and held together by the simple, human act of remembering. To understand how the ancient Slavs imagined the universe, it helps to let go of modern ideas about space, distance, and order. Their world was not a vast emptiness dotted with stars and planets. It was intimate, layered, and alive. Everything had its place, not measured in miles or heights, but in meaning. The universe was not something far away to be studied. It was something you lived inside of, something that pressed in from all sides, shaping every moment of existence. At the center of this worldview was the understanding that reality was divided into realms, each overlapping the other in ways that were felt rather than seen. The world of humans was only one layer among many, above it, below it, and within it existed other domains, each with their own forces, spirits, and laws. These realms were not sealed off. They touched constantly. A dream, an illness, a sudden stroke of luck. Any of these could be signs that the boundary had briefly thinned. The universe was often imagined as vertical rather than horizontal, structured like a great living pillar or tree. Its roots sank deep into the unseen, while its branches stretched upward into light and sky. This image was not symbolic in the abstract sense. Trees were everywhere in Slavic lands, towering, enduring, and mysterious. They lived longer than humans, survived countless seasons, and seemed to bridge earth and sky effortlessly. It felt natural to imagine the universe itself working the same way. At the lowest level lay the realm associated with death, decay, and hidden wealth. This was not necessarily a place of punishment. It was simply where things went when they left the surface world. Seeds disappeared into the soil before new life emerged. Bodies returned to earth and fed what came next. Darkness here was not evil, but necessary. It was the quiet that allowed transformation to occur. The middle realm was a world of humans, animals, forests, and rivers. It was the most unstable layer, constantly affected by the forces above and below. Storms, droughts, disease, and fortune flowed into it from other realms, often without warning. Humans lived here not as rulers, but as negotiators, always trying to maintain balance between competing influences. Above this lay the realm of sky and light, associated with order, clarity, and power. Thunder, lightning, and the movement of celestial bodies were seen as expressions of authority rather than random events. The sky watched. It judged. It reminded humans that some forces were far greater than their own efforts. Looking upward was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder that protection and punishment could arrive from the same direction. These realms were not abstract concepts discussed in isolation. They were experienced through daily life. A sudden storm could feel like the sky reaching down. A strange dream might feel like the underworld whispering upward. The universe was constantly in motion, with energy flowing between layers in ways that demanded attention and respect. The boundaries between realms were believed to be weakest at certain times and places. Dusk and dawn, when light and darkness blended, were especially significant. So were crossroads, riverbanks, forest edges, and threshold between indoors and outdoors. These were places of transition, where ordinary rules could falter. People behaved carefully in such spaces, speaking softly, offering small gestures of respect, avoiding unnecessary risk. Time itself was understood as cyclical rather than linear. The universe did not move toward a final conclusion. It turned. Seasons repeated. Life emerged, faded, and returned in altered forms. This cycle gave meaning to suffering and loss. Winter was not an end, but a phase. Death was not disappearance, but passage. The universe endured even as individual lives did not. Stars and celestial movements were observed, but not mapped with precision. Their significance was emotional rather than mathematical. Certain patterns were associated with seasons, omens, or the moods of higher forces. The sky was a story unfolding slowly overhead, its meaning revealed through repetition rather than calculation. Within this cosmic structure, humans had a role, but not a central one. They were participants in a larger system, capable of influencing outcomes through behavior, ritual, and respect, but never fully in control. This humility shaped how people approached the unknown. Arrogance felt dangerous. Listening felt wise. The universe was also morally complex. Good and bad were not fixed categories. Forces could help or harm depending on context. A flood might destroy homes but renew soil. A harsh winter might kill the weak but preserve the strong. The cosmos did not operate on human ethics. It followed its own logic, one that humans try to understand through myth rather than challenge through force. This worldview created a deep sense of interconnectedness. Nothing existed in isolation. Actions rippled outward, affecting not just people, but spirits, ancestors, and future generations. Carelessness could disturb balance. Respect could restore it. Even small acts mattered, because the universe was always listening. When misfortune struck, it was rarely seen as random. Something had shifted. Something had been neglected or angered. The response was not panic, but reflection. What had changed? What had been forgotten? What needed to be restored? Mythology provided a language for asking these questions, even when answers remained uncertain. In this cosmic vision, mystery was not a problem to be solved. It was a reality to be lived with. The unknown was accepted as part of existence, woven into the structure of the universe itself. This acceptance allowed fear and peace to coexist. One could feel small without feeling meaningless. As belief systems from outside eventually arrived, bringing different ideas about the structure of reality, this older worldview did not vanish overnight. Its patterns were deeply embedded in how people thought about space, time, and meaning. Even when names changed, the sense of layered reality remained. The idea that the world was more than what could be seen did not disappear. It simply found new expressions. To imagine the Slavic cosmos is to imagine a universe that breathes. A universe where sky, earth, and underworld are not distant places, but ever-present forces, where balance matters more than dominance, and where humans walk carefully, aware that every step echoes beyond the surface world. In this vision, the universe does not demand worship through grand structures or loud declarations. It asks for attention, for humility, for the quiet acknowledgement that existence is shared, layered, and always moving, even when it appears still. Before there were named gods with distinct faces and personalities, before thunder was given a voice and the earth a guardian, there was an idea so vast and quiet that it barely resembled a god at all. It was not a figure who ruled from above or demanded devotion through fear. It was presence itself. The ancient Slavs understood creation not as a single explosive moment, but as a slow awakening, and at the heart of that awakening was Rod. Rod was not imagined as a being who stood apart from the universe. He was a universe becoming aware of itself. Creation did not begin with chaos being defeated or shaped by force. It began with breath, with emergence, with something unnamed stirring in the darkness and realizing it could exist. This concept made Rod less of a ruler and more of a source, a quiet origin from which everything else unfolded. The act of creation, in this worldview, was not dramatic. There were no wars in the sky or monsters torn apart to form the world. Instead, the universe grew, the way a seed breaks open underground, slowly, silently, without witnesses. The first movements were subtle, almost imperceptible. Light did not explode into being. It seeped outward. Matter did not crash into place. It settled. Rod was associated with birth in all its forms. Not only the birth of gods and humans, but the birth of ideas, families, and destinies. His influence was felt in lineage, in the continuity of bloodlines, in the quiet knowledge that each life was connected to those that came before and those that would follow. In this sense, creation was never finished. It continued through every generation. Rather than separating creator and creation, Slavic belief placed them in constant relationship. Ra did not withdraw once the world existed. He remained woven into it, present in ancestry, in fate, in invisible threads connecting people across time. To speak of Ra was not to invoke a distant god, but to acknowledge the deep continuity of existence. This idea shaped how people understood themselves. Identity was not individualistic in the modern sense. A person was not just a single life moving independently through the world. They were the product of countless lives before them, carrying forward something larger than themselves. Birth was sacred not because it was miraculous, but because it extended the act of creation itself. The Slavic concept of creation did not prioritize domination or control. There was no sense that the world was made to be conquered. It was made to be lived within. This perspective fostered humility. Humans did not stand at the center of creation. They occupied a place within it, alongside animals, spirits, and forces far older than memory. Ra's presence was often implied rather than spoken. There were no elaborate temples dedicated solely to him. No grand myths describing his actions in detail. His influence was too foundational, too constant to be dramatized. He existed in beginnings and transitions, in moments when something new quietly took shape. This subtlety made Ra difficult to find, even for those who believed in him. He was not easily personified. Attempts to give him a human form felt limiting, almost disrespectful. Instead, his presence was sensed in patterns. The repeating rhythms of life, the inheritance of traits, the way families resembled one another across generations. Creation, in this view, was deeply relational. Nothing came into being alone. Everything emerged from something else, connected through unseen lines of cause and consequence. This understanding made fate feel less like a fixed script and more like a woven fabric, constantly shaped by countless threads. The idea of breath was especially significant. Breath marked the transition from non-existence to life. The first breath of a newborn echoed the first stirring of the universe. To breathe was to participate, however briefly, in the same creative force that brought everything into being. In this sense, life was not separate from creation. It was creation continuing. Because Ra was associated with ancestry and lineage, remembering the dead became an act of honoring creation itself. Ancestors were not gone. They were part of the ongoing flow. Their lives shaped the present, and their influence extended into the future. Forgetting them was not just loss, it was a break in continuity. This belief encouraged a deep respect for family and community. Individual actions mattered not only for personal outcomes, but for how they affected the line as a whole. Shame and honor extended beyond the self. One's behavior reflected on those who came before and those yet to be born. Unlike later religious systems that emphasize obedience to divine law, this early Slavic understanding emphasized alignment. The goal was not to submit, but to remain in harmony with the underlying flow of existence. When things went wrong, when illness struck or fortune turned, people did not assume punishment. They looked for imbalance. Something had shifted. Something needed attention. Ra's influence could be felt most strongly in moments of beginning and ending. Birth, marriage, death, and transition carried a sense of gravity. These were not just personal milestones, but points where the fabric of existence was visibly moving. Rituals surrounding these moments were quiet, focused, and deeply symbolic, reinforcing continuity rather than spectacle. As other gods emerged in Slavic mythology, taking on clearer roles and personalities, Ra did not disappear. He receded into the background, becoming the silent foundation upon which everything else rested. Thunder gods could clash. Earth goddesses could nurture. Spirits could mischief or protect. But all of them existed because creation had already happened and continued to happen through him. When later belief systems arrived, with creation stories that emphasized singular acts and fixed beginnings, the older idea did not vanish entirely. It transformed. Ra's influence lingered in folk traditions, and the emphasis on family, ancestry, and fate. Even when his name was no longer spoken, his presence remained embedded in how people understood life's continuity. To contemplate Ra is to consider creation not as an event, but as a process, one that never truly ends. It is a comforting idea, especially in a world shaped by uncertainty. Nothing emerges from nothing, and nothing is ever truly lost. Everything flows forward, changing form, carrying traces of what came before. In this quiet vision of creation, there is no need for spectacle, no demand for belief through fear. Creation simply is, unfolding patiently, breath by breath, generation by generation. And within that unfolding, every life, no matter how small or fleeting, becomes part of something vast, enduring, and deeply interconnected. When the sky darkened and the air grew heavy, when distant rumbles rolled across the horizon and made the ground seem to listen, the ancient Slavs believed they were hearing the voice of order itself. Thunder was not noise. It was declaration. It was a sound of force that did not ask permission and did not explain itself. This force had a name, and it was spoken with caution. Purin. Purin was not a god who lingered quietly in the background of belief. He arrived suddenly, announced by lightning and the sharp crack of splitting wood. His presence was felt in moments of intensity, when the balance of the world seemed momentarily unstable. Storms were his language, and through them he reminded humans that power existed beyond their control. Unlike the subtle, almost invisible presence of creation itself, Purin was unmistakable. He was associated with height and visibility, with the open sky and the tops of mountains, with tall trees struck by lightning. Where Rod was continuity, Purin was action. Where creation flowed quietly, Purin intervened. But this intervention was not random. Purin represented order, law, and the maintenance of balance. His thunderbolts were not expressions of chaos, but of correction. When something threatened the structure of the world, whether a rival force, a broken oath, or moral disorder, Purin responded. The violence of storms was not cruelty, it was necessity. In Slavic belief, the world was fragile, always at risk of slipping into imbalance. Order had to be defended continuously, not established once and forgotten. Purin embodied this ongoing struggle. He was vigilant, watchful, and unforgiving when boundaries were crossed. To live under his sky was to live with the understanding that actions mattered. Oaths were sacred under Purin's gaze. Promises spoken aloud, especially those sealed by ritual, carried weight because they were believed to be witnessed from above. Breaking an oath was more than a social offense. It was an act that disrupted cosmic order. Thunder following deceit could be interpreted as judgment, a warning that balance had been disturbed. Purin was often associated with warriors and leaders, but not in the romantic sense of glory-seeking conquest. His protection was given to those who upheld stability and defended community. Violence for its own sake did not please him. Force had meaning only when it served order. This distinction mattered deeply in a world where survival often depended on conflict. Weapons linked to Purin, axes, hammers, arrows, were symbols of focused power. They were tools that could protect or destroy depending on intent. Lightning itself was imagined as a thrown weapon, precise rather than indiscriminate. When lightning struck a tree or rock, it was seen as deliberate, as if something had been singled out for correction. Trees struck by lightning were treated with reverence. They were not simply damaged objects, but sites of divine contact. Wood from such trees might be preserved or used carefully, believed to carry protective qualities. Even destruction left behind meaning. Nothing Purin did was wasted. Despite his fearsome reputation, Purin was not a distant tyrant. He was deeply involved in the rhythms of life. Rain brought by storms nourished crops. Thunder cleared the air. Lightning reshaped landscapes. His power was both destructive and sustaining, reflecting the dual nature of force itself. This duality made Purin complex. He could not be reduced to a simple image of good or evil. To anger him was dangerous, but to live without his presence would be worse. Without storms, fields would dry. Without enforcement, order would decay. Fear and gratitude existed side by side in how people related to him. Purin's position in the sky placed him in constant tension with forces below. The world beneath the surface, dark, fertile, unpredictable, stood in contrast to his clarity and height. This opposition was not personal in the human sense, but structural. It was a universe maintaining balance through opposing energies. Storms, in this context, were not signs of divine anger toward humanity as a whole. They were expressions of an ongoing struggle that humans happened to witness. When thunder rolled, people listened not for condemnation, but for meaning. What was shifting? What was being corrected? Rituals dedicated to Perun were often conducted in open spaces, under the sky, near tall trees or high ground. These were places where his presence felt strongest. Offerings were made not to appease him emotionally, but to acknowledge his role. Respect mattered more than devotion. Awareness mattered more than affection. Perun's authority extended into governance and law. Leaders invoked his name to legitimize decisions, to remind communities that order was not arbitrary. Justice was not merely a human agreement. It echoed a larger structure. To rule unjustly was to risk not only rebellion, but cosmic imbalance. Yet, for all his power, Perun was not omnipotent. He did not control everything. His strength lay in enforcement, not creation. This limitation made the world dynamic rather than static. Order existed, but it had to be maintained. The struggle never ended. As belief systems changed and new religions arrived, Perun's image was reshaped rather than erased. His association with thunder and authority made him easy to merge with new divine figures. The sky god endured, even as his name faded. Storms continued to inspire awe. Thunder continued to sound like judgment. In memory and folklore, Perun remained a presence of tension. He reminded people that the world was not gentle, but it was not meaningless either. There was structure, even in chaos. There was intention, even in violence. Understanding this did not eliminate fear, but it gave it shape. To live beneath Perun's sky was to accept responsibility. Actions echoed upward. Choices mattered beyond immediate consequence. Order was not guaranteed. It depended on continual attention and respect. In this way, Perun was not just a god of storms. He was a reminder that stability itself requires force, and that peace is something the universe works for again and again, through thunder, lightning, and the crack of a breaking sky. If Perun ruled the open sky with thunder and light, then Veles belonged to everything that lay beneath. He was not announced by sudden sound or blinding flashes. He arrived quietly, through shadows, through mist, through the subtle feeling that something unseen was moving just out of reach. Where Perun stood for clarity and order, Veles represented ambiguity, transformation, and the fertile darkness from which life and decay both emerge. Veles was associated with the earth in its most intimate forms, with soil that swallowed seeds, with roots twisting invisibly underground, with caves and lowlands where water gathered and refused to move. He was linked to livestock, wealth trade, and the slow accumulation of material things. Unlike the sky's authority, his power was subtle and patient. It crept rather than struck. This made Veles deeply unsettling, but also deeply familiar. He governed the spaces humans relied on, but could never fully control. Herds could thrive or vanish. Trade could bring prosperity or ruin. Crops depended on what happened beneath the surface, beyond sight. Veles embodied this uncertainty. He reminded people that not all power announced itself. Some power waited. The underworld associated with Veles was not a place of eternal punishment. It was a realm of transition, storage, and transformation. Things went there to change, not to end. Wealth, in this sense, was not only material. Knowledge, secrets, and even souls passed through Veles's domain. He was the keeper of what was hidden, not the destroyer of what was lost. This made his relationship with Perun inevitable. The two forces were not enemies in a personal sense, but opposites in function. Sky and earth, height and depth, law and trickery, light and shadow. Their conflict was eternal because balance required tension. Without Veles, the world would become rigid and sterile. Without Perun, it would dissolve into chaos. Story spoke of Veles as a shapeshifter, a deceiver who could take the form of a serpent, a bear, or a shadow moving through tall grass. This fluidity reflected his nature. He did not obey fixed boundaries. He crossed them. He blurred them. In doing so, he challenged the order imposed from above. When misfortune struck, when cattle fell ill, when floods destroyed fields, when trade collapsed, Veles was often blamed. But blame was not the same as hatred. People understood that loss was part of the cycle. Veles did not act out of cruelty. He acted out of necessity. What grew too stable needed disruption. What accumulated too much needed redistribution. This belief created a complicated emotional relationship. Veles was feared, but also respected. He was not prayed for comfort, but acknowledged for his role. Ignoring him felt dangerous. To pretend that the dark, hidden aspects of life did not exist was to invite imbalance. Offerings of Veles were often made quietly, away from open spaces. Forest edges, marshes, riverbanks, places where land softened into water, were considered appropriate. These were liminal zones, neither fully one thing nor another. Speaking too loudly in such places was discouraged. Silence showed respect. Veles's connection to magic and knowledge made him especially intriguing. He was associated with cunning, with the ability to see beyond appearances. Those who understood the hidden workings of the world, shamans, healers, tricksters, were thought to operate under his influence. Wisdom was not always bright and clean. Sometimes it was murky, uncomfortable, and unsettling. The struggle between Perrin and Veles was not a single myth, but a repeating pattern reflected in natural events. Thunderstorms represented moments when order descended to confront chaos. Floods and droughts showed the earth pushing back. Each victory was temporary. Neither side could win permanently, because the world required both. In this sense, Veles represented the parts of existence that resisted control. He governed chance, luck, and misfortune. He reminded people that effort did not guarantee outcome. One could work diligently and still fail. One could make no plans and still prosper. This unpredictability was not a flaw in the universe. It was a feature. Death, too, fell within Veles's domain. But it was not feared as annihilation. Death was a crossing, a descent into transformation. The dead moved into the earth, into memory, into stories. They became part of the hidden network that sustained the living. Ancestors watched not from the sky, but from beneath, close to the roots of life. Because of this, graves and burial sites were treated with deep respect. They were thresholds, not endings. Disturbing them risked unsettling forces that preferred to remain undisturbed. Remembering the dead was a way of maintaining balance, of acknowledging the ongoing relationship between surface and depth. As societies changed and new beliefs spread, Veles became increasingly misunderstood. His association with the underworld and trickery made him an easy target for demonization. What had once been seen as necessary darkness was reinterpreted as evil. Complexity was flattened into opposition. Yet traces of Veles persisted. Folk tales about clever devils, forest spirits, and trickster figures carried his essence. Stories where intelligence outwitted authority echoed his defiance of rigid order. Even in moralized narratives, the appeal of cunning remained. Veles speaks to a truth that is difficult to accept, that life cannot be fully controlled, predicted, or purified. There will always be hidden forces shaping outcomes beyond intention. There will always be value in what is unseen, unspoken, and unresolved. In acknowledging Veles, the ancient Slavs acknowledged their own limitations. They accepted that not everything could be explained or governed. This acceptance did not weaken them. It allowed them to endure, to adapt, to survive in a world where certainty was rare. Between thunder and shadow, between sky and soil, the universe found its balance. And in that balance, Veles waited, not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a force to be recognized. Quiet, patient, essential. The struggle between Perrin and Veles was never confined to distant myth or abstract belief. It unfolded constantly in the world people could see and feel. Every storm, every shifting season, every sudden change in fortune was understood as part of this ongoing tension. The universe was not static. It breathed, strained, corrected itself, and moved again. And humans lived inside that motion, watching for signs, listening for meaning. When thunderclouds gathered low and dark, it was not merely weather approaching. It was a moment when the balance of the world tilted. The sky pressed downward, the earth answered upward, and somewhere between them the clash occurred. Rain fell not as punishment or gift alone, but as consequence. The land drank deeply, rivers swelled, fields transformed. Destruction and nourishment arrived together, inseparable. Storms were the most dramatic expression of this eternal battle. But they were only one part of a much larger rhythm. Seasons themselves were shaped by the same forces. Spring was not simply warmth returning. It was release. The earth loosened its grip, allowing life to push upward again. This was Velis yielding space, allowing growth to escape the underworld hold. Summer followed as a fragile equilibrium, a time when balance held, but only temporarily. Autumn carried a different tone. Leaves fell, crops were harvested, and daylight began to fade. It was a time of preparation and acceptance. The sky grew more distant, the earth more demanding. People sensed that the downward pull was strengthening. Winter was not seen as an enemy, but as dominance shifting once more. The surface world quieted, frozen and still, while life retreated inward. These cycles were not comforting in a simplistic way. They were reminders that stability was temporary. No season lasted forever. No victory was permanent. Perrin might assert order through storms and rain, but Velis always waited, patient beneath the surface, ready to reclaim what had been given. This understanding shaped how people related to time. They did not expect constant progress or improvement. They expected fluctuation. Good years followed bad ones. Abundance followed scarcity. To survive emotionally, one had to accept this movement rather than resist it. Hope existed, but it was measured. Optimism was cautious. Rituals aligned with these cycles were less about changing fate and more about acknowledging it. When storms arrived, people did not attempt to command the sky. They sought to understand what was happening, to show respect, to remain aligned. Offerings were gestures, not bribes. They signaled awareness rather than control. The eternal battle was also reflected in daily human experience. Order and chaos were not distant cosmic forces. They played out in families, communities, and individual lives. A well-run household mirrored Perrin's clarity. A neglected one slipped toward Velis's domain. Conflict, illness, and misfortune were interpreted through this lens. Something had tipped too far in one direction. Even emotions were understood as part of this dynamic. Anger, passion, ambition carried the energy of storms. Fear, desire, sorrow belonged to the depths. Neither was condemned outright. Both were necessary. Trouble arose only when one overwhelmed the other. This worldview allowed people to make sense of suffering without needing to explain it away. Loss did not mean abandonment by the universe. It meant that the cycle had turned. Something was being taken back, so that something else could eventually emerge. This did not erase pain, but it gave it context. Nature offered constant reminders of this truth. Floods reshaped land that had seemed permanent. Droughts humbled even the most prepared communities. Forests reclaimed abandoned settlements. Ruins did not symbolize failure. They symbolized return. The earth did not forget. It absorbed. Lightning striking the same place repeatedly reinforced the idea that certain points were contested, charged, unstable. Sacred groves, ancient trees, and specific hills were believed to lie along these invisible fault lines. Standing there felt different. The air felt heavier. Voices lowered instinctively. These were places where the battle felt close. People learned to live attentively, not obsessively fearful, but aware. Watching the sky was not superstition. It was observation. Reading the land was not mysticism. It was survival. Over time, these practices became layered with meaning, turning practical knowledge into myth. The eternal struggle also offered a form of comfort. If chaos and order were locked in balance, then no disaster was final. Destruction was followed by rebuilding. Loss was followed by renewal. Even death fit into this pattern. The dead moved downward, into Velis's domain, becoming part of the hidden foundation that supported future life. This perspective softened fear of endings. Nothing truly vanished. It changed form. It moved from one layer to another. The universe recycled itself endlessly, guided by tension rather than resolution. As belief systems evolved, this deep understanding of cycles proved difficult to erase. Even when new narratives framed the world differently, people still felt the seasons in their bones. They still sensed when balance shifted. They still respected the forces that could not be reasoned with. The struggle between Perrin and Velis was never meant to be won. Victory would have meant stagnation or collapse. Their opposition was the engine of existence itself. Storms cleared the air. Floods renewed soil. Winter forced rest. Spring rewarded patience. In accepting this, the ancient Slavs found a way to live without demanding certainty. They learned to endure uncertainty, to find meaning in repetition, and to trust that even when the world seemed hostile, it was following patterns older and larger than any single life. The sky would rage, the earth would answer, and somewhere between thunder and silence, life would continue, shaped by forces locked in eternal conversation, never at peace, yet never entirely at war. While the sky thundered and the earth shifted beneath unseen forces, there existed another presence in Slavic belief that did not announce itself through violence or deception. It did not clash loudly with rivals or demand attention through fear. Its power was quieter, steadier, and far more intimate. This presence was felt in the steady rhythm of daily life, in hands working wool, in soil pressed gently around seeds, in the unseen threads that bound fate together. This was the domain of Mokash. Mokash was not distant. She did not live far above or deep below. She existed close to human life, woven into it so completely that her presence could be felt without being named. She was associated with the earth, but not the wild, untamed earth of storms and floods. She embodied the fertile ground that received care and returned sustenance, the earth that responded to patience rather than force. Her influence was strongest where life was sustained quietly and continuously, in the home, in the fields, in the careful work done by women, whose labor rarely announced itself but held everything together. Spinning, weaving, tending crops, caring for children, these were not seen as small tasks under Mokash's gaze. They were sacred acts because they preserved life and continuity. Unlike the sharp authority of Purin or the unsettling ambiguity of Veles, Mokash represented endurance. She did not reshape the world in moments of crisis. She kept it functioning through constancy. Her power was not felt in sudden change, but in things that lasted. Healthy soil, strong families, remembered traditions. Mokash was deeply connected to water and moisture, to rain that soaked gently rather than struck violently, to springs that flowed steadily from the earth. Dryness and neglect were signs of imbalance. Care and attention restore harmony. In this way, her presence reinforced the idea that life thrived through relationship, not domination. Women, in particular, felt a strong connection to Mokash, not because she excluded men, but because she understood cycles that women lived through intimately. Birth, growth, pain, patience, loss, and renewal all fell within her domain. She governed fate not as a fixed destiny, but as something woven over time, thread by thread, influenced by countless small actions. The image of weaving was central to how Mokash was understood. Life was not carved in stone or written in the sky. It was woven. Threads crossed and tangled. Some broke. Others were repaired. The pattern was never fully visible while it was being made. Only in retrospect could one see how moments connected. This understanding brought comfort in uncertainty. When things went wrong, it did not always mean failure or punishment. It meant that the pattern was still forming. Something had shifted, but the weave continued. Patience mattered. Care mattered. Nothing was wasted entirely. Mokash was also associated with protection. Homes were believed to thrive under her watchful presence. Neglecting daily rituals, cleaning, tending fires, respecting tools, was not merely laziness. It was disrespect toward the balance she maintained. Disorder invited instability. Attention restored calm. Her worship was simple and quiet. There were no towering temples or dramatic sacrifices. Small offerings, whispered thanks, and careful observance of traditions were enough. Respect was shown through action rather than declaration. One honored Mokash by living well, by sustaining life rather than chasing power. This made her influence difficult to erase when new belief systems arrived. Even when her name faded, her role remained. Domestic rituals continued. The association between women, fate, and the earth persisted. She was absorbed rather than destroyed, reshaped into new symbols and figures that carried her essence forward. Mokash also represented moral grounding. While Purin enforced law through consequence and Veles challenged stability through disruption, Mokash maintained ethical continuity through care. She reminded people that survival was not enough. How one survived mattered. Exploitation without respect led to imbalance. Carelessness harmed not just individuals, but the fabric holding everything together. Her presence softened the harsher aspects of Slavic cosmology. Without her, the world would have been defined entirely by struggle and uncertainty. With her, there was room for tenderness, for nurture, for repair after damage. Even fate, under Mokash's influence, was not entirely rigid. Threads could be adjusted, mistakes could be mended. While no one could escape the cycle of life and death, how one moved within it mattered deeply. Compassion was not weakness. It was strength that sustained continuity. In moment of loss, Mokash offered a different kind of solace than sky gods or underworld keepers. She did not promise triumph or secret knowledge. She offered endurance. The reassurance that pain would be absorbed into the larger weave, that life would continue. Changed but unbroken, this quiet resilience reflected the reality of the world's Slavic communities inhabited. Survival depended less on heroic acts and more on steady cooperation. The ability to endure harsh winters, raise children, preserve food, and maintain social bonds matter more than individual glory. Mokash embodied these truths. As societies modernized and myths were reshaped into stories, her influence lingered in subtle ways. The reverence of the land, the respect for women's labor, the belief that fate could be influenced through patience and care, all of these carried echoes of her presence. In a pantheon defined by thunder and shadow, Mokash stood as a reminder that life is sustained not only by force and transformation, but by gentleness and persistence. She held the world together not by commanding it, but by tending it. Through her, the ancient Slavs acknowledged a truth that remains deeply human, that the quiet work of sustaining life is as sacred as any storm, and that without care, even the most powerful forces unravel. In the soft rhythm of spinning wheels and soil darkened by rain, in the unspoken knowledge passed from mother to child, Mokash lived on, unseen, steady, and essential. Beyond the great forces that shaped sky, earth, and fate, there existed a quieter multitude of presences that touched nearly every moment of daily life. These were not distant gods invoked only during storms or crises. They were felt in the warmth of fire, in the rising of the sun, in the ache of love, and the inevitability of death. Together, they formed a sacred background hum, a spiritual ecosystem woven into ordinary routines. The sun was not merely a source of light. It was a living power, dependable yet never taken for granted. Each sunrise marked survival. Each sunset carried uncertainty. Solar deities were associated with vitality, protection, and the steady rhythm of time. Their movement across the sky reassured people that order still held, that darkness, however long, would eventually give way to light again. Fire, too, held divine presence. It was both gift and danger. It warmed homes, cooked food, and protected against predators, yet it could destroy everything in moments of neglect. Fire gods were respected with careful attention. Flames were never treated casually. To tend a hearth was to participate in sacred balance, keeping chaos at bay through vigilance. Love and desire were governed by forces that felt deeply human. These were not idealized, perfect emotions. They were messy, unpredictable, and powerful. Attraction could bring joy or ruin. Fertility ensured survival but carried risk. Deities associated with love did not promise happiness. They promised intensity. Passion was a force to be respected, not controlled. Fate occupied a unique space among these lesser gods. It was not singular or absolute. It was layered, influenced by ancestry, choice, and circumstance. Fate was not seen as an unchangeable decree, but as a path shaped gradually through action and attention. Some forces guided it. Others tested it. Everyone lived within its weave. Harvest gods reflected gratitude and anxiety in equal measure. The success of crops depended on countless factors beyond human control. These deities embodied hope, patience, and acceptance. Rituals surrounding harvest were solemn and thankful, acknowledging not just abundance, but vulnerability. Even in success, humility mattered. Water spirits and river gods were approached with caution. Water sustained life, but demanded respect. Rivers could feed villages or erase them. Springs were treated as sacred sources, places of quiet power. Speaking loudly or carelessly near water felt dangerous, as if one might disturb something listening beneath the surface. Gods of travel and crossroads reflected the uncertainty of movement. Journeys were risky. Roads were unmarked. Leaving home meant entering spaces where protection weakened. Offerings at crossroads acknowledged this vulnerability, asking for safe passage rather than triumph. Even illness had divine association. Disease was not purely random. It reflected imbalance. Healing gods and spirits were not miracle workers. They worked slowly, through herbs, rituals, and patience. Recovery required alignment, not demand. These gods were not ranked in importance by abstract hierarchy. Their significance shifted with circumstance. A traveler cared more for protection than harvest. A parent feared illness more than storms. Belief was practical, responsive, deeply tied to immediate need. This intimacy made mythology flexible. Gods were approached not through rigid doctrine, but through lived experience. Respect mattered more than perfection. Forgetfulness could be forgiven. Arrogance could not. As new religions arrived, many of these gods faded quietly. Their roles were absorbed into saints, superstitions, and folk practices. The names changed. The functions remained. Lighting candles, whispering wishes, thanking unseen forces for safe return. What endured was not the pantheon itself, but the worldview it supported. That life was shaped by many small forces. That survival depended on attention. That the sacred existed not only in the sky or earth, but in everyday acts repeated with care. In acknowledging these gods, the ancient Slavs acknowledged the complexity of existence. Life was not governed by a single will, but by countless influences interacting constantly. Understanding this did not grant control. It granted awareness. And in that awareness, there was a quiet comfort, the sense that nothing happened entirely alone, that even ordinary moments were touched by something greater, unseen, and deeply intertwined with human life. As a god shaped the vast patterns of sky, earth, and fate, another presence lingered much closer to human life, moving quietly through spaces that felt familiar, yet never entirely safe. These were the spirits who lived alongside people, unseen but deeply involved, inhabiting homes, forests, fields, and waters. They were not distant divine forces, but neighbors of a different kind, capricious, intimate, and impossible to ignore. Every home was believed to shelter more than just a family who lived within it. Beneath the hearth behind walls, or in dark corners where dusk gathered, a house spirit might reside, watching, listening, and reacting to behavior of those it shared space with. This presence was not inherently benevolent or malicious. It reflected the household itself. A respectful, orderly home encouraged protection. Neglect and conflict invited trouble. The idea that a spirit observed daily behavior created a sense of quiet accountability. People moved with care, not out of fear, but awareness. Objects were not thrown carelessly. Fires were tended attentively. Small gestures of respect, leaving a bit of food, speaking softly at night, acknowledged the shared nature of the space. Beyond the walls of the home, the forest held a different kind of spirit. Dense, ancient, and unpredictable, the forest was never just a collection of trees. It was a living realm governed by beings who did not value human convenience. Travelers entering woodland spaces knew they were guests. Paths could shift. Sounds could mislead. A familiar route could suddenly feel wrong. Forest spirits embodied this unpredictability. They were tricksters, guardians, and punishers all at once. They might guide a respectful traveler safely through, or lead a careless one in circles until exhaustion set in. Getting lost was not simply misdirection. It was a lesson. The forest demanded humility. Water spirits were perhaps the most feared. Rivers and lakes were lifelines, yet they were also places where people vanished. Water moved silently, concealed depth, and offered no warning before danger. Spirits associated with water reflected this duality. They could appear beautiful, inviting, even comforting, but beneath that surface lay risk. Stories of water spirits often served as caution. Children were warned not to wander too close. Adults approached with ritual and respect. These spirits did not represent evil. They represented the truth that not everything welcoming was safe. Fields and boundary spaces had their own presences. Places where cultivated land met wilderness were especially sensitive. Spirits here governed transitions. They ensured balance between human order and natural chaos. Crossing such spaces without acknowledgement felt risky, as if stepping across an unseen line. What united these spirits was their closeness to human experience. Unlike gods, they reacted immediately. Disrespect could bring swift consequence. Kindness could bring subtle protection. Their justice was not moral in the abstract. It was situational, responsive, personal. This made relationships with spirits deeply practical. People did not seek enlightenment or salvation from them. They sought coexistence. The goal was not worship, but harmony. Understanding how to live alongside these beings was as important as understanding weather or seasons. Fear played a role, but it was not paralyzing. It sharpened attention. It encouraged listening. Silence in certain places was not emptiness. It was presence. Speaking loudly, laughing carelessly, or ignoring surroundings felt like an invitation to trouble. These beliefs reinforced the idea that humans were never alone. Every action occurred within a network of unseen observers. This did not create constant anxiety. It created mindfulness. Carelessness was discouraged not through punishment alone, but through story and example. As with gods, spirits varied by region and environment. A spirit of one forest might behave differently in another. Local knowledge mattered. Elders passed down warnings and guidance shaped by experience rather than doctrine. Knowing which places to avoid and which to respect could mean the difference between safety and loss. As Christianity spread, these spirits did not vanish. They were too embedded in daily experience. Instead, they were reinterpreted. Some became demons. Others were softened into fairy tale figures. Their lessons remained, even as their meanings shifted. Stories continued to be told, especially to children. Tales of spirits lurking near water or in forests served both to entertain and to instruct. Fear became a teaching tool. Imagination carried practical wisdom. These spirits also reflected psychological truths. The home felt different when tense or calm. The forest felt threatening when one was lost or careless. Water felt inviting yet dangerous. Mythology gave shape to these feelings, turning instinct into narrative. Living with spirits meant accepting that control was limited. One could not dominate the environment. One could only negotiate with it. This humility fostered resilience. People adapted rather than conquered. Even today, echoes of these beliefs remain. The discomfort felt in abandoned houses, the unease of deep forests, the caution near dark water. These sensations persist. They speak to an inherited awareness, shaped long ago. In Slavic mythology, spirits were not relics of superstition. They were expressions of lived experience, reminders that the world was responsive, observant, and alive. To ignore that truth was to invite imbalance. And so people listened. They moved carefully. They remembered stories. They left offerings, not because they were weak or fearful, but because they understood that survival depended on respect for what could not be seen. Death, to the ancient Slavs, was never a sudden void or an absolute ending. It was a movement, a crossing, a quiet transition from one state of being into another. Life did not vanish when breath stopped. It changed its address. It moved deeper into the unseen layers of the world, slipping beneath the surface just as seeds disappeared into soil before returning as green shoots months later. This understanding softened fear, without removing it. Death was still painful, still heavy with loss, but it was not meaningless. The dead were not gone. They remained close, woven into the land, the household, and the memory of the living. To live was to walk among ancestors whose presence could still be felt, even if they no longer spoke aloud. The soul was not imagined as a single, simple thing. It was layered, much like the universe itself. Parts of a person lingered near the body. Other parts traveled onward. Some dissolved into the land, becoming part of its hidden vitality. This complexity reflected how people experienced grief. Loss was not clean or immediate. It unfolded slowly in waves, as different aspects of a loved one faded or transformed. Burial was therefore not a disposal of the dead, but a negotiation with the unseen. Bodies were returned carefully to the earth, often accompanied by objects that mattered in life. These items were not offerings of wealth, but of identity. Tools, ornaments, simple possessions, things that signal continuity rather than separation. The dead were not stripped of selfhood. They were equipped for transition. Graves were placed thoughtfully. Location mattered. The land itself participated in the process. Burial sites were often near settlements, reinforcing the idea that the dead remained part of the community. Distance implied abandonment. Proximity implied care. The act of burial was slow and deliberate. Silence was respected. Words were chosen carefully. Excessive noise felt disruptive, as if it might confuse or disturb the soul's passage. Grief was expressed, but not theatrically. Mourning was steady rather than explosive, mirroring the belief that death was a gradual movement rather than a sudden rupture. After burial, the relationship did not end. Ancestors were remembered through regular rituals, meals, and quiet acknowledgement. The dead were invited into the rhythm of life, not as ghosts haunting the living, but as unseen witnesses. They were believed to influence fortune, health, and harmony, especially within families. This ongoing connection created a sense of responsibility. One did not live only for oneself, but as part of a line stretching backward and forward through time. To dishonor ancestors was to weaken the foundation upon which the present stood. Memory was not optional. It was essential. Death was also understood as a return. The body returned to the earth. Breath returned to the wind. Warmth returned to fire. Nothing was wasted. This view aligned with the broader Slavic belief in cycles rather than conclusions. Everything fed into something else. Because of this, fear of the dead was complex. Ancestors were respected and sometimes feared, but not as monsters. Fear arose when balance was broken. Improper burial, forgotten rituals, unresolved conflict. These created unrest. The dead did not haunt without cause. Disturbance signaled neglect. Stories of restless spirits often carried moral weight. They warned against abandonment, disrespect, or unresolved wrongdoing. Such stories reinforced social responsibility rather than supernatural terror. The message was not that death was dangerous, but that relationships extended beyond it. The underworld was not imagined as a fiery abyss or a place of eternal punishment. It was a realm of quiet storage and transformation, a place where things rested, changed, and prepared to re-enter the cycle in another form. Darkness here was not malevolent. It was necessary. Time moved differently in this realm. It was not measured by days or seasons. It was measured by readiness. Souls lingered until transformation was complete. This idea offered comfort to grieving. Separation was not final. It was temporary in a cosmic sense, even if permanent in a human one. Illness and death were closely linked in belief. Serious sickness was seen as a liminal state, a point where the soul hovered between layers. Healing rituals focused not only on the body, but on calling the soul back, persuading it to remain. Death occurred when that persuasion failed, not because of punishment, but because the balance tipped. This perspective encouraged acceptance alongside effort. People fought illness, but they did not rage against death endlessly. There was an understanding that some transitions could not be prevented, only honored. Children were introduced to death early, not through horror, but through familiarity. They attended rituals. They heard stories. Death was part of life's rhythm, not an interruption of it. This exposure reduced shock while preserving respect. As seasons changed, so did the perceived closeness of the dead. Certain times of year were believed to thin the boundary between worlds. During these periods, ancestors were remembered more actively. Food was shared symbolically. Fires were lit. Silence was observed. These practices reaffirmed continuity. The dead were not worshipped as gods, but they were not powerless. Their influence was subtle. A sudden stroke of luck, averted disaster, a dream carrying advice. These signs were interpreted cautiously, never demanded. Ancestors gave when they chose. This relationship with death created a culture deeply aware of impermanence. Life was precious not because it was permanent, but because it was fleeting. Actions mattered because they echoed beyond individual existence. Legacy was not measured in fame, but in memory and continuity. When new religions arrived with more rigid concepts of heaven and hell, these older beliefs did not disappear entirely. They adapted. The reverence for ancestors persisted. The sense of layered existence remained. Death continued to feel like a crossing rather than a judgment. Even today, Echoes of this worldview survive. The instinct to speak softly near graves. The feeling that the dead are listening. The comfort found in remembering loved ones through ritual and routine. These are not remnants of fear, but of connection. For the ancient Slavs, death was not an enemy to be defeated. It was a passage to be respected, a movement into another form of existence, woven seamlessly into the ongoing life of the world. And so the living walked carefully, knowing that every step echoed downward as well as forward, and that beneath the soil, beneath memory, beneath silence itself, something endured, watching, waiting, and remaining part of the story long after breath had faded. Life for the ancient Slavs moved according to rhythms far older than memory, and those rhythms were honored through ritual. These were not elaborate ceremonies performed by distant priests, but shared acts woven into the turning of the year. Ritual was not something separate from daily life. It was how daily life was aligned with the unseen forces believed to shape everything. As winter loosened its grip and the first signs of thaw appeared, people watched the land closely. The return of birds, the softening of soil, the lengthening of days were not taken lightly. Spring was a moment of vulnerability. Life was stirring again, but it was fragile. Rituals at this time focused on protection and encouragement, acknowledging that rebirth was never guaranteed. Songs were sung, fires were lit, and simple offerings were made to invite warmth, fertility, and balance back into the world. Fire played a central role in many seasonal observances. It was both purifier and bridge. Flames were believed to carry messages upward and ward away lingering winter spirits. Jumping over small fires, circling them, or carrying embers from sacred flames into homes were acts meant to transfer protection and renewal. Fire did not destroy here. It transformed. As spring deepened into early summer, rituals shifted toward growth and abundance. Fields were prepared with care, not just through labor, but through symbolic gestures. Seeds were planted with quiet words spoken aloud or inwardly, acknowledging the partnership between human effort and unseen forces. To plant without acknowledgement felt arrogant, as if claiming sole credit for what could never be fully controlled. Water rituals became especially important during this time. Rivers, springs, and rain were honored as life-givers. Washing in flowing water, offering wreaths or small objects, and observing periods of silence near water sources were ways of showing respect. These acts recognized water's power to sustain and to take away. Summer festivals were often the most communal and celebratory. Long days and warm nights allowed gatherings that felt almost timeless. Music, dance, and shared meals reinforced social bonds while honoring the height of life's energy. These moments were joyful, but not careless. Joy itself was seen as sacred, something that strengthened balance rather than disrupted it. As the year moved toward harvest, rituals took on a more reflective tone. Gratitude became central. The gathering of crops was accompanied by thanks, not celebration alone. People understood that abundance was temporary. What was taken now had to last through winter. Wastefulness was not just impractical. It was disrespectful. Harvest rituals often included symbolic acts of sharing with the unseen. A portion of food might be set aside. The first or last sheaf might be treated with special care. These gestures acknowledged that the land had given generously, and that taking without thanks invited imbalance. Autumn also carried an awareness of approaching darkness. Days shortened. Cold returned. Rituals during this time focused on preparation and remembrance. Ancestors were honored more actively. Fires were kept burning longer. Stories were told not just for entertainment, but to carry memory through the coming months. Winter rituals were quieter, inward-facing. Survival itself became the focus. The world seemed to sleep, and human activity slowed to match it. Rituals emphasized protection, endurance, and continuity. Small daily acts, tending the hearth, sharing food, maintaining tools, became sacred through repetition. Certain nights were believed to thin the boundary between worlds. During these times, people acted with particular care. Loud noises were avoided. Hospitality increased. Doors might be left symbolically open. These practices reflected the belief that unseen visitors might pass close, and that respect ensured harmony. Rituals were not rigidly fixed. They adapted to local conditions and changing needs. What mattered was intention and awareness, not perfect execution. Mistakes were not catastrophic. Neglect was. Forgetting to acknowledge the forces shaping life was more dangerous than performing a ritual imperfectly. Participation mattered more than understanding. Children learned by watching and joining, absorbing patterns before meaning. Ritual created continuity across generations, linking the living to the dead and the yet-to-be born. It reminded people that they were part of something ongoing, not isolated in time. These seasonal observances also reinforced patience. Nothing could be rushed. Rituals marked time rather than altering it. They taught acceptance of waiting, of endurance, of trusting cycles larger than individual desire. As external religions arrived, many of these rituals did not disappear. They changed names, adapted symbols, and continued quietly. Seasonal festivals were reinterpreted. Fires were still lit. Food was still shared. Memory persisted beneath new explanations. The enduring power of these rituals lay in their grounding. They did not promise escape from hardship. They offered structure within it. They provided moments of reflection, connection, and shared meaning in a world defined by uncertainty. Through ritual, the ancient Slavs learned to live with the land rather than against it. They marked time not by clocks, but by transformation. They accepted that life moved in cycles, and that honoring those cycles was essential for balance. In repeating these acts year after year, generation after generation, people did more than preserve tradition. They reaffirmed their place within the world's rhythm. They reminded themselves, quietly and consistently, that existence was shared, fragile, and deeply interconnected. And in that repetition, there was comfort, a sense that even as individuals passed, the pattern continued. Fires would be lit again. Seeds would be planted again. Stories would be told again. The world would turn and ritual would remain, guiding life gently through each change. In the spaces where stories were told softly and warnings were wrapped in metaphor, creatures began to take shape. They were not invented for entertainment alone, nor were they meant to terrify without purpose. These beings emerged from shared fear, observation, and imagination, shaped by the landscapes people moved through and the dangers they faced. Slavic mythical creatures were not separate from life. They were extensions of it, given form so that the unknown could be spoken about without being named directly. These creatures often appear at the edges of understanding. In forests where visibility faded quickly, in swamps where the ground shifted beneath careless steps, in abandoned places where silence felt too complete, they embodied uncertainty. To give that uncertainty a face was not to exaggerate it, but to make it recognizable. Many of these beings were not purely monstrous. They were ambiguous, unpredictable, capable of harm or help depending on circumstance. This reflected a worldview in which danger was rarely absolute and safety was never guaranteed. A creature that lured travelers off a path was not necessarily evil. It represented the consequences of arrogance, distraction, or disrespect for unfamiliar terrain. Stories of forest-dwelling beings often describe figures that could mimic human voices or appear briefly before vanishing. These tales mirrored real experiences, sounds echoing strangely among trees, shadows moving just beyond sight, the disorienting effect of deep woodland. When someone became lost, the explanation was not incompetence, it was interference. The forest itself, through its inhabitants, had responded. Such stories served a purpose. They taught caution. They reminded listeners to stay aware, to travel with respect, to avoid wandering alone without preparation. Fear became a teaching tool, softened by narrative. Children learned boundaries not through instruction alone, but through imagination. Swamps and marshes gave rise to creatures that pulled the unwary downward, into water that looked shallow but was not. These beings reflected the real danger of landscapes that concealed depth beneath stillness. The warning was clear: do not trust surfaces. What appears calm may hide risk. Water spirits were often described as alluring, even beautiful, drawing people closer before revealing their danger. This duality mirrored water itself. Rivers sustained life, but could erase it in moments. Lakes invited rest, but concealed cold depths. The creatures of water were not punishers. They were reminders. Night gave shape to other fears. Darkness reduced visibility, distorted sound, and invited imagination to fill gaps left by sight. Creatures associated with night were often linked to illness, exhaustion, or emotional vulnerability. They preyed not on strength, but on weakness, on those who wander when tired, sick, or distracted. These beings were not random inventions. They reflected patterns people noticed. Accidents happened more often at night. Illness worsened in darkness. Fatigue made mistakes more likely. Myth transformed these observations into narrative. Some creatures were tied to abandoned spaces, old homes, forgotten roads, ruins overtaken by nature. These places carried emotional weight. They spoke of neglect, loss, and the passage of time. Creatures that inhabited them represented what happened when places are forgotten or left unattended. Disorder invited presence. The monstrous was often a mirror. Creatures that punished greed, laziness, or cruelty reinforced social values. A being that stole from the selfish or frightened the cruel was not merely frightening. It was corrective. Through story, behavior was shaped gently, without formal rule. Appearance mattered less than function. Many creatures changed shape or appeared differently to different people. This reflected how fear itself operates. What terrifies one person might not frighten another. The creature adapted to the listener, becoming whatever was most unsettling to them. Importantly, these beings were rarely defeated through force. Outsmarting them, respecting boundaries, or correcting behavior was far more effective. This reinforced a worldview where dominance was not the solution to danger. Awareness was. Over time, as stories traveled, creatures blended and evolved. Names changed, traits shifted. Some became exaggerated, others softened. The core remained. They marked danger, uncertainty, and moral boundaries. When new belief systems arrived, many of these creatures were reclassified. Some became demons. Others were reduced to fairy tale villains. Yet their original purpose remained visible beneath these layers. They continued to warn, to instruct, to shape behavior. Even stripped of belief, their influence lingered. People still felt uneasy in certain places. Still warned children away from water or forests at dusk. Still sensed that some spaces required silence. These creatures also allowed people to externalize fear. Instead of internalizing anxiety, fear was placed outside, given shape and story. This made it manageable. Something with a name and behavior could be anticipated, could be avoided. In this way, Slavic mythical creatures were not symbols of ignorance. They were tools of survival. They encoded environmental knowledge, social norms, and emotional truths into stories that could be remembered easily and shared widely. They also provided a sense of companionship in fear. To believe a creature existed was to know that others had felt the same unease. That fear was shared, not personal weakness. Story created community. As centuries passed and landscapes changed, many of these creatures faded from daily belief. Forests were cleared. Roads were marked. Science explained what myth once held. But explanation did not erase feeling. The unease remained, quieter but present. Today, these creatures survive in folklore, art, and memory. They no longer guard forests or waters in the way they once did, but they still whisper reminders to be careful, to pay attention, to respect the unknown. In Slavic mythology, monsters were never simply monsters. They were teachers shaped like warnings, born from the land itself. And even as their stories soften with time, the truths they carried remain, waiting at the edges of awareness, just beyond the light. Among the forests, rivers, and household hearts where gods and spirits lingered, the ancient Slavs recognized a subtler kind of power, one that moved quietly through everyday life, shaping outcomes in ways both practical and mysterious. This was the power of folk magic, charms, and the practitioners who mediated between the visible and invisible worlds. Magic was not an abstract system of spells and rituals removed from reality. It was practical, relational, and intimately tied to the uncertainties of life. Women often carried knowledge of these practices, passed down through generations. They were healers, protectors, and keepers of hidden wisdom. Their work was careful and deliberate, rooted in observation and experience. It drew from herbs, water, fire, and the rhythm of the seasons. Magic was not performance or spectacle. It was craft, skill, and attention to the forces that surrounded daily life. Healing occupied a central role. Illness was interpreted as an imbalance, a disturbance in the flow of energy, or the favor of unseen forces. A fever, a persistent cough, or a sudden injury could signify that something had shifted beyond the visible world. Practitioners of magic acted as mediators, restoring balance through herbs, spoken words, and ritual gestures. They did not promise miraculous cures. They worked with what could be observed and with what had been passed down through memory and experience. Charms were another essential tool. Small objects, words, or actions would protect the household, livestock, and crops. A charm might be hidden in a doorway to guard against misfortune. A whispered phrase over a field could encourage fertility. These acts were never casual. Attention and intention mattered more than complexity. The power of magic was rooted in respect, precision, and consistency. Divination also held importance. People sought guidance in moments of uncertainty, before travel, planting, marriage, or other significant decisions. Signs were read in the flight of birds, the formation of clouds, patterns in fire, or the arrangement of objects. These readings were subtle, often interpreted in context rather than as absolute truth. They provided a framework for decision-making in a world where certainty was rare. Magic extended beyond individuals to protect communities. Some practitioners were called upon to safeguard entire villages during times of hardship, drought, or invasion. Protective rituals often involved the participation of multiple households, reinforcing social bonds and shared responsibility. Magic was not merely individual practice. It was woven into the collective life of the community. The tools of magic were drawn from nature itself. Plants, roots, water, and fire were not symbolic alone. They were conduits of force. Each carried properties observed over generations. Some herbs healed. Some repelled insects or spirits. Some were associated with protection against misfortune. Knowing when and how to use them required memory, patience, and observation. Ritual gestures were often subtle. Actions repeated consistently carried meaning. A sweep of the hand, a sprinkling of water, a whispered phrase, each had significance. Magic was embedded in ordinary movements, making life itself an ongoing interaction with unseen forces. In this way, belief and practice were inseparable. Practitioners of folk magic were respected and sometimes feared. Their knowledge granted influence, but also imposed responsibility. Misuse or neglect could lead to imbalance, harm, or social censure. Power without care was dangerous. Respect for limits, ethics, and context was essential. This magic was flexible. It adapted to circumstance. What worked for one household might not for another. What protected crops in one season might be ineffective in another. Practitioners learned to observe, adjust, and improvise. Knowledge was living, not fixed. Many practices overlapped with spirituality. A charm might invoke a god, a spirit, or a natural force. Prayer and ritual were intertwined. Magic was not separated from belief. It was an extension of it. The line between divine intervention and human action was blurred. Humans acted, but they acted within a larger network of forces. Folk magic also addressed social and emotional needs. Love, fertility, reconciliation, and personal protection were concerns just as vital as physical survival. Magic acknowledged that human life was complex, that desire and fear shaped behavior as powerfully as storms or famine. In this sense, it was deeply humane, responding to both material and emotional realities. Over time, folk magic became intertwined with myth. Spirits, deities, and legendary creatures were invoked in spells and rituals. The practitioner navigated these forces with care, drawing on stories and observation to interpret signs and outcomes. Myth provided both guidance and context for action. Magic was also intimately connected to timing. Certain days, seasons, or lunar phases were seen as more favorable for specific practices. This reflected a broader understanding of cycles, rhythm, and natural order. Acting in harmony with these cycles amplified effectiveness and demonstrated awareness of the larger forces at work. Even as Christianity spread, folk magic persisted. Many practices were absorbed into Christian rituals, saints, and local customs. What mattered was effectiveness and continuity, not doctrinal purity. The underlying logic that unseen forces could be engaged through observation, care, and intention remained intact. Folk magic reinforced a worldview in which humans were neither powerless nor dominant. It acknowledged uncertainty, offering tools to navigate it without claiming absolute control. Life was a negotiation, not a conquest. Actions mattered because they were embedded in larger patterns, and attention, care, and respect were essential for survival and well-being. Through these practices, people maintained agency in a world governed by gods, spirits, and unpredictable natural forces. Magic was practical wisdom rendered visible and actionable. It was the embodiment of human understanding of subtle cause and effect, applied with humility and attentiveness. In essence, folk magic in Slavic culture was a living bridge between the known and unknown, the visible and invisible. It connected humans to gods, spirits, and the cycles of nature, offering a way to navigate life's uncertainties with both care and creativity. Practitioners were guides, interpreters, and mediators, ensuring that the rhythms of life, death, and survival remained in balance. This quiet power, embedded in daily life and ritual, demonstrates the ingenuity and adaptability of the Slavic worldview. It shows that magic was not merely superstition, but a system of understanding, responding, and maintaining harmony within a complex and unpredictable world. Through careful observation, skillful action, and respectful engagement, people shaped outcomes, protected their communities, and honored the unseen forces that made existence both precarious and meaningful. The arrival of Christianity in Slavic lands was not sudden or violent, but gradual, subtle, and transformative. It did not descend from the sky with thunder or break open the soil with unseen hands. Instead, it crept quietly through settlements, rivers, and trade routes, carried by travelers, missionaries, and emissaries of distant kingdoms. For the people who had lived for generations with gods and spirits who were close, intimate, and tangible, this new faith arrived as both curiosity and challenge, offering different stories about creation, morality, and the afterlife. At first, many Slavs perceived Christianity as another layer of unseen forces, rather than a complete replacement for what they already knew. Priests and missionaries taught that there was one God, omnipotent and absolute, whose rules governed the cosmos. This deity was unlike the layered, interactive forces of their own mythology. Purin's thunder might still roll across the horizon, Vela's shadowed power might still linger in the forest, and Mokash's quiet guardianship might still hold sway in the home. Yet the new teachings carried authority that could not be ignored. Written scriptures, formal rituals, and the promise of eternal reward or punishment introduced an entirely new dimension of consequence. This shift was not universally welcomed. Some embraced Christianity readily, attracted to its promise of order, salvation, and community structure. Others resisted, quietly maintaining the old ways, performing rituals in secret, or passing knowledge of spirits and ancestral practices down through memory rather than written text. The tension between old and new beliefs was not a battle in the open, but a subtle negotiation in daily life. Households might light candles to saints while leaving small offerings for the domovoi, the household spirit who had always watched over the home. Forest paths might be blessed in the name of Christ, even as cautionary tales of Leshy and Rizalki were whispered to children. The two worlds overlapped, blended, and sometimes conflicted. One of the most profound effects of Christianization was a gradual redefinition of gods and spirits. Those who had once been honored with ritual and respect were reframed as saints, demons, or figures of folklore. Purin's thunder could be interpreted as a work of Saint Elijah, a figure associated with storms in Christian tradition. Vela's underworld dealings might be recast as the influence of malevolent forces. Mokash, deeply tied to the home, fertility, and fate, sometimes merged with the veneration of Mary or local saints, preserving her essence under a new guise. These adaptations allowed the old beliefs to persist in altered form, softening resistance while maintaining continuity. The moral framework of Christianity introduced a new lens through which to understand the universe. Whereas Slavic mythology emphasized cycles, balance, and relational harmony, Christian doctrine emphasized obedience, sin, and divine judgment. Human actions were no longer evaluated solely by their impact on community, balance, or survival, but also by alignment with the will of a single deity and adherence to codified moral laws. This shift brought a sense of clarity and order that contrasted with the ambiguity of earlier beliefs. Yet for many, it also brought tension. The world had previously been understood as a space of negotiation and caution, not absolute moral binaries. Adapting to this new perspective required reinterpretation of both daily life and myth. Ritual practices also transformed. Seasonal observances that once honored the cycles of nature and the whims of local spirits were gradually overlaid with Christian ceremonies. Harvest festivals became associated with saints' days. Fires and water offerings were redirected toward blessings and holy symbols. Even death, once understood as a layered passage through the underworld, began to be interpreted through Christian concepts of heaven, hell, and purgatory. Ancestors remained honored, but the emphasis shifted from relational continuity and ongoing presence to spiritual reward and divine judgment. Despite these changes, the old ways were never completely eradicated. In rural communities, especially, elements of pre-Christian belief persisted quietly alongside new teachings. Certain rituals continued in practice, if not in name. Offerings were left for household spirits. Charms were placed for protection, and stories of mythical creatures were still told to maintain awareness of danger. Christianity often absorbed these practices rather than confronting them directly, providing reinterpretations rather than prohibitions. This blending allowed communities to retain a sense of familiar agency, while gradually incorporating new structures of belief. The arrival of Christianity also reshaped social and political structures. The centralized authority of the Church introduced hierarchical control over moral and ritual life that had not previously existed in the same way. Religious leaders mediated between people and divine power in ways that altered the distribution of influence within villages and communities. Where previously elders, shamans, or skilled practitioners had guided ritual practice, priests and bishops began to hold formal authority, sometimes aligning spiritual power with emerging political systems. This shift introduced both stability and tension, reinforcing obedience to external authority while challenging older systems of communal and household-based governance. Education and literacy became tools of Christianization. Written scripture and the use of religious texts allowed knowledge to be standardized and disseminated in ways that oral traditions could not compete with. Stories, songs, and ritual knowledge that had been passed down for generations were now subject to reinterpretation, translation, and codification. Memory remained vital, but its authority was challenged by the permanence of the written word. Over time, communities adapted, blending literacy with oral practice, using text to reinforce but not entirely replace traditional understanding. Christianity also reframed the human relationship with nature and the unseen. Where previously storms, floods, and forest spirits were part of living negotiation requiring observation and caution, they were increasingly interpreted as manifestations of divine will or moral consequence. The unpredictability of weather or illness could now be attributed to sin, testing, or providential design rather than the interaction of competing cosmic forces. This reinterpretation provided a sense of explanation and moral order, but also reduced the subtlety of previous understanding, flattening complexity into singular causality. Yet even in this shift, traces of older belief persisted in daily life. People continued to leave small offerings for the land or water, to observe particular days with care, and to teach children caution through stories of spirits and unseen dangers. Folk practices blended seamlessly with Christian observance. Saints' days coincided with older festivals, providing continuity and reducing the sense of rupture. Memory, adaptation, and subtle negotiation allowed belief to survive, even under new frameworks. The psychological effect of this transformation was profound. The world had previously been experienced as participatory, relational, and cyclical. People acted within networks of visible and invisible forces, negotiating survival, prosperity, and harmony. With Christianity, action was still meaningful, but the criteria for interpretation changed. Success, failure, fortune, and misfortune were now measured not only in material or social terms, but in moral and spiritual alignment. Human responsibility expanded into the realm of morality, law, and eternal consequence. This duality created tension, but also resilience. Individuals and communities learned to operate within overlapping systems of belief. One could honor a saint while leaving a token for a domovoi. One could observe moral law while still respecting the cycles of nature. Adaptation became a skill, blending old awareness with new expectation. Over time, the lines between pre-Christian and Christian understanding blurred, creating a hybrid spiritual landscape uniquely suited to local life. Through this process, the gods of old did not vanish entirely. They transformed, receded, and persisted in subtle ways. Perm became associated with Christian storm saints. Veles lingered in folklore and stories of underworld tricksters. Mokasha's influence endured in domestic care and respect for women's labor. Even creatures, charms, and seasonal observances survived as echoes, integrated into new practices. The essence of the old worldview remained, though expressed differently. The gradual arrival of Christianity thus represents not an abrupt end, but a layered transformation. Myth did not simply die. It adapted. It merged with new ideas, reinterpreted itself, and persisted in altered form. For the Slavs, this meant that spiritual life became simultaneously familiar and new, rooted in the land, the home, and the cycles of life, yet increasingly framed by the moral and cosmological order of a single deity. Ultimately, this period demonstrates the resilience of belief. Even as one system gained dominance, the older one persisted through adaptation, memory, and practical integration into daily life. People navigated multiple realities, negotiating between past and present, visible and invisible, old gods and new authority. In doing so, they preserved continuity while participating in transformation, ensuring that Slavic spirituality, though changed, continued to shape understanding of the world, human behavior, and the unseen forces that moved through every forest, river, and hearth. Even as Christianity spread and redefined belief across Slavic lands, many myths refused to disappear completely. They were stubborn, subtle, persistent, hiding in plain sight within daily life, folklore, and seasonal rituals. The gods and spirits that had once commanded attention and respect did not vanish all at once. Instead, they transformed, adapted, and integrated into the emerging spiritual landscape, taking new forms and new names while continuing to influence human behavior, thought, and imagination. These surviving myths reveal how deeply Slavic spirituality was rooted in the lived experience of people, how intimately it was connected to land, memory, and survival, and how resilient cultural imagination can be when faced with profound change. The endurance of these myths can be traced to several key factors. First, the nature of oral tradition itself allowed stories to be flexible. Myths had never been fixed in stone or ink. They were passed from generation to generation by memory, repeated by storytellers who adjusted details to reflect local circumstances, seasonal changes, and personal experience. This fluidity meant that when external belief systems arrived, the stories could adapt rather than collapse. A tale of Veles, once central to understanding the underworld, could become a cautionary folk tale about tricksters or thieves. The core lessons, imagery, and moral resonances remained even if the original theological framework shifted. Household and nature spirits proved particularly resilient. Domovoi, for example, remained a fixture in homes long after formal Christian teachings had taken hold. These household spirits were not erased because they were intimately tied to daily life. They could protect a home, warn of danger, or punish misbehavior, but only if acknowledged properly. Even when church authorities condemned certain practices as superstitious or heretical, villagers continued to leave small offerings of bread or milk, sweep floors carefully, and speak respectfully to ensure harmony. Domovoi, like many domestic spirits, were invisible partners in survival. They were practical as much as spiritual. People had learned through experience that ignoring them often led to misfortune, and thus their presence endured through habit, respect, and cultural memory. Water spirits, Leshy, Ruzalki, and other creatures inhabiting the liminal spaces of forests, rivers, and marshes also persisted in folklore. These beings were often reframed as cautionary tales rather than religious objects of worship, but their impact on behavior remained profound. Ruzalki, for example, became associated with drowned women, fertility, and seasonal cycles, transforming grief, anxiety, and warnings into narrative form. The stories taught respect for water, caution the forest, and mindfulness of seasonal changes. By embedding practical knowledge within compelling stories, these myths retained significance even when overt pagan worship diminished. They carried survival wisdom encoded in narrative, a form of practical guidance that was difficult for new religious authority to eliminate entirely. Rituals tied to the agricultural calendar also preserved pre-Christian beliefs. Seasonal observances, such as the spring planting festivals, midsummer celebrations, and harvest ceremonies, continued even as saints and Christian holidays were overlaid onto them. The same fires, dances, and offerings remained, but the invocations changed. A fire that once honored the returning sun might now be lit in the name of a saint, but the essential act, inviting fertility, warmth, and protection, remained intact. The timing of these rituals, tied to natural cycles, could not be altered easily. The community depended on them for practical survival. In this way, myths lived on, embedded in action rather than doctrine. The figure of Mokosh exemplifies how pre-Christian deities persisted through adaptation. Mokosh, once a goddess of fertility, domestic labor, and fate, became associated with saints and Christian protective figures, blending old and new. Her domain, the home, women's labor, weaving, and agriculture, remained vital, regardless of whether she was called by her original name or reinterpreted through Christian lenses. In practice, the daily acknowledgement of her influence continued, demonstrating how mythology survived through utility and embedded cultural norms rather than formal worship alone. Another reason myths persisted was psychological. The Slavic understanding of a universe, where humans were participants in a network of layered forces, was deeply ingrained. Even with the overlay of Christian theology, people still experienced storms, illness, death, and unpredictable fortune in ways that recall the old cosmology. Thunder and lightning might be interpreted as the act of Purim, transformed into a story of a Christian saint, but the emotional and psychological experience, the awe, the fear, the need to interpret and respond, remained unchanged. Humans could not simply discard the frameworks that had helped them survive, interpret risk, and navigate uncertainty for generations. Furthermore, these myths were intertwined with moral and social education. Stories of creatures, spirits, and gods carried implicit lessons about behavior, responsibility, and community norms. Children learned caution, respect, and ethics through narrative, fear of the forest, respect for water, reverence for household harmony, all lessons embedded in myth, could not be easily replaced by abstract doctrine alone. Folk tales carried memory, teaching survival and social cohesion simultaneously. Even if the theological justification shifted, the behavioral imperatives persisted, allowing myth to endure under new interpretations. The adaptation of myth into local folklore also ensured its survival. Oral storytellers continued to weave narratives that preserved old gods and spirits in ways compatible with Christian morality. Velas could appear as a cunning figure in folk tales rather than as a deity of the underworld. Thunder gods might be merged with Christian saints associated with storms, preserving the narrative tension between order and chaos without violating new religious norms. These transformations allowed myths to continue influencing thought and behavior subtly, integrated into culture rather than opposed to it. Another important vector for survival was ritual and symbolism embedded in domestic and communal life. Many practices associated with old gods and spirits became habitual or symbolic gestures rather than acts of formal worship. Protecting the home with offerings, lighting fires during seasonal transitions, observing lunar and solar cycles, and marking thresholds were practices that retained meaning even when the theological rationale was Christianized. The physical and social act, rather than the verbal acknowledgement of the deity, ensured continuity. Myth survived in practice, in repetition, and in rhythm. Even the concept of fate, once governed by divine figures like Mokosh or Rod, endured subtly in popular consciousness. People continued to interpret events as connected, meaningful, and influenced by forces beyond immediate perception. While the narrative framing might shift, attributing causality to God rather than ancestral or household spirits, the underlying perception of a layered reality persisted. Life was still seen as interconnected, cyclical, and relational. Humans acted within a web of cause and effect, moral responsibility, and spiritual consequence, echoing the older cosmology. The preservation of myth was also reinforced by art, poetry, and memory. Stories were sung in quiet tones by elders, inscribed in folk songs, woven into rituals, or enacted in seasonal festivals. These cultural forms were resilient because they were participatory, experiential, and emotionally resonant. They did not rely on formal instruction, textual authority, or elite approval to survive. Instead, they thrived in communal memory, adapting with subtlety to fit new contexts. In this way, myths were living, evolving entities rather than fixed narratives. Moreover, Slavic mythology's endurance reflects a human need to maintain continuity with the past. Ancestors, landscapes, and everyday survival shaped cultural imagination profoundly. Even when belief systems change, memory and experience preserve patterns of thought. Forests that once housed Leshy remain mysterious and dangerous. Water that once harbored Rizalki continued to inspire caution. Fire, earth, and household order retain symbolic importance. Myth, as a repository of practical knowledge and emotional truth, could not be fully erased because it was encoded into the rhythm of life itself. Resistance to erasure was subtle, quiet, and pervasive. It did not necessarily appear as overt defiance, but as persistent attention to old ways, storytelling, and ritual adaptation. People retained knowledge of spirits and gods in their daily habits, in the words they whispered to children, in the songs sung at seasonal festivals. Even as outward conformity to Christian observance increased, the old mythology persisted, surviving through nuance, repetition, and lived experience. Interestingly, the myths that refused to die also provided a psychological buffer during times of cultural transformation. As external authorities shifted moral and spiritual norms, the old stories offered continuity and reassurance. They reminded people that the universe, while now framed differently, was still inhabited by forces to be respected and interpreted. They provided continuity, grounding, and a sense of control within uncertainty. The enduring myths became a bridge between past and present, old and new, familiar and foreign. Even centuries later, echoes of these persistent myths remain. Folk tales, superstitions, and customs embedded in daily life reflect a worldview where human action is intertwined with unseen forces, where respect, attention, and awareness matter. The forest, river, hearth, and field continue to carry cultural memory, shaped by ancient stories and reinforced by ritual, even when the theological framework has changed. The persistence of these myths demonstrates that belief is not simply about overt worship or doctrinal adherence. Even as centuries pass and external influences reshape the spiritual landscape of Slavic lands, the mythology of the Slavs endured quietly, weaving itself into everyday life, local traditions, and oral storytelling. It adapted, transformed, and persisted, not as a rigid religious framework, but as a living, breathing network of narrative, memory, and practice that shaped how communities understood the world around them. The myths that survived were no longer always invoked in ritual worship or formal rites. Instead, they found new life in fairy tales, folk songs, proverbs, and cultural memory, embedding themselves in the subconscious rhythm of social and personal life. This transformation illustrates the remarkable flexibility and resilience of Slavic mythology, capable of carrying meaning even when stripped of formalized religious context. In fairy tales, for instance, the gods, spirits, and mystical forces of Slavic mythology were reimagined as characters and archetypes that could instruct, warn, and entertain simultaneously. Figures like the domovoi, previously household spirits deserving offerings and respect, became household protectors in story form, appearing as trickster guides, helpers, or warnings for children. Ruzalki, originally associated with water, fertility, and the underworld, were recast as beautiful but dangerous young women whose stories taught caution near rivers and lakes, reminding listeners of the hidden risks of nature and human behavior. Even creatures once feared for their direct influence on life and death became literary devices for teaching social norms, morality, and survival skills. These stories retain the essence of the original myths, the warning, the moral lesson, the connection between human action and unseen consequence, while translating them into forms that can endure under the changing cultural and religious circumstances of the post-Christianization era. Folk songs carried a similar function. Long before literacy was widespread, songs acted as vehicles of memory and instruction. They preserved narrative elements, seasonal knowledge, and the rhythms of life connected to the natural world. Agricultural practices, weather prediction, and seasonal transitions were often encoded in lyric and melody. References to deities or spirits, though increasingly symbolic or metaphorical, reminded communities of patterns that needed attention. Singing a song about a forest spirit or a river deity was not simply entertainment. It was a form of cultural reinforcement, a ritualized practice of awareness that kept knowledge alive across generations. These songs also facilitated emotional processing, allowing communities to express fear, hope, longing, and joy collectively, in ways that mirror the original psychological functions of myth. proverbs, and sayings also preserved the wisdom of the old myths. Even when the gods themselves were no longer invoked directly, the behavioral rules and cautionary lessons embedded in folklore endured through language. Warnings to respect the forest, honor the household, or observe seasonal cycles were expressed succinctly in maxims that guided behavior subtly and effectively. In this way, myth became a moral and practical framework, carried not in formal religion but in the everyday words and habits of people. The underlying principles, attention to environment, respect for cycles, awareness of consequences, remain intact, demonstrating that mythology's survival often depended less on overt belief than on its integration into lived experience. Storytelling became the primary medium for the continued transmission of Slavic mythology. In small villages, by firesides, and during communal gatherings, elders would recount tales of gods, spirits, and creatures that blended reality and imagination. These stories were not fixed texts. They were fluid, evolving with each retelling to fit local context, seasonal circumstances, or the moral needs of the listeners. Each retelling reinforced cultural memory, embedding lessons about survival, social cohesion, and respect for the unseen world. The adaptability of oral storytelling allowed myths to remain meaningful even as formal worship declined or Christianization recast the original cosmology. Storytellers, often unaware of the ancient theological context, were the custodians of myth, preserving its psychological and moral core while reshaping its narrative form for new audiences. Communities also preserved mythology through seasonal and domestic rituals, even when the original theological rationale had been replaced. Certain days, often associated with pre-Christian festivals, continue to be observed with symbolic acts that echoed the old beliefs. Spring planting rituals, midsummer fire festivals, and harvest ceremonies persisted, sometimes overlaid with Christian saints' days or holy observances, but retaining their original structure and meaning. Lighting fires, making offerings of food, and observing ritualized sequences were practical as much as spiritual. They marked time, reinforced social cohesion, and maintained awareness of the cycles of life, death, and fertility central to Slavic cosmology. In this sense, ritual became a medium for cultural memory, ensuring that myth endured even in altered form. The persistence of Slavic mythology in fairy tales, songs, proverbs, and ritual practices also served a psychological function. Humans have a natural need to make sense of the world, particularly of events that are unpredictable or frightening. Slavic myths, with their gods, spirits, and creatures, provided a framework for interpreting uncertainty. Stories of forest spirits, household guardians, and water-dwelling beings help people understand the dangers of nature, the consequences of human actions, and the rhythm of life and death. Even when these narratives were no longer treated as literal truth, their symbolic power endured. They allowed communities to process fear, anticipate risk, and cultivate awareness in ways that were both socially and practically meaningful. An important aspect of this endurance was the integration of myth into social norms. The characters, narratives, and warnings embedded in folklore functioned as guides to behavior. Tales of mischievous spirits punished disrespectful children or negligent adults, reinforcing norms around care, attention, and propriety. Stories of generosity rewarded through divine favor maintained social cohesion. Myth thus operated as both moral pedagogy and cultural memory, ensuring that ethical principles, practical knowledge, and social expectations were transmitted across generations, even in the absence of formal religious education. The adaptability of myth also extended to its interaction with Christianized belief systems. Many stories, rituals, and symbolic practices were reinterpreted to align with new religious frameworks while preserving their essential functions. Saints could take on the roles of former gods, moral lessons could be reframed in Christian terms, and rituals could be performed under the guise of new observances while retaining their practical intent. The enduring presence of Slavic mythology in later folk memory and cultural practice is a testament to its deep integration into the rhythms of life, the human imagination, and the social fabric of communities. By the time Christianization had taken root across Eastern Europe, the gods, spirits, and mystical forces that once dominated consciousness had largely been reinterpreted, absorbed, or suppressed in formal religious practice. Yet, even in this transformed environment, the myths persisted, not as organized theology or ritualized worship, but as living frameworks embedded in stories, domestic customs, seasonal observances, and the very way people navigated the world. They endured because they were functional, emotionally resonant and adaptable, capable of teaching lessons, shaping behavior, and preserving collective memory long after formal belief had shifted. Central to this endurance was the ability of mythology to encode practical knowledge about survival, the environment, and human relationships. Ancient Slavic communities lived in landscapes that could be both generous and unforgiving. Dense forests, unpredictable rivers, marshes, and shifting weather patterns demanded attention, awareness, and care. The myths embedded in daily life acted as cognitive tools for navigating these spaces. Forest spirits, such as the Leshy, warned travelers to respect boundaries, pay attention to landmarks, and avoid unnecessary risk. Water spirits reminded communities of the dangers of rivers, lakes, and marshes, emphasizing caution in spaces where humans were vulnerable. Even when these beings were reframed as folkloric characters or cautionary tales in post-Christian contexts, their practical lessons remained relevant. Myth became a form of environmental literacy, teaching risk assessment, spatial awareness, and survival skills in narrative form. Folk memory preserved these lessons in ways that were emotionally compelling. Stories, songs, and proverbs embedded moral and practical instruction within emotionally resonant narratives. Fear, wonder, curiosity, and caution were encoded in mythic stories, allowing listeners to internalize lessons without formal instruction. A child hearing a story of a rusalka in a river could experience a subtle but powerful reinforcement of the rule not to approach dangerous water alone. A tale of a misbehaving household spirit punished by chaos would teach respect for domestic responsibilities, order, and attention to routine. Myths thus operated on multiple levels. They entertained, instructed, and shaped behavior simultaneously. Emotional engagement ensured that the lessons were memorable and transmitted across generations, even when the original theological framework had faded. The survival of myth and folk memory was also reinforced by its integration into seasonal and agricultural rituals. Many of the Slavic gods and spirits had originally been tied to cycles of planting, growth, harvest, and winter survival. Even after Christianization, these cycles remained essential for subsistence, and rituals adapted to preserve their function. Spring planting ceremonies, midsummer bonfires, and autumn harvest festivals continued, often syncretized with Christian saints' days or observances. The underlying practices, lighting fires, offering symbolic gifts, performing ritual gestures, remain intact because they regulated human activity in accordance with environmental and social rhythms. Mythology persisted as embodied practice, surviving through action, repetition, and communal memory rather than doctrinal adherence. Household rituals were particularly resilient. Domovoi, the protective household spirit, continued to influence domestic behavior long after Christianity had introduced saints and angels as formal guardians. Households maintained offerings of bread, milk, or small tokens, performed routine cleaning and maintenance with care, and observed quiet behavior thresholds, acknowledging the unseen presence in subtle but meaningful ways. These practices reinforced family cohesion, encouraged attention to domestic responsibilities, and preserved continuity between generations. They also maintained a psychological sense of control in a world shaped by unpredictable natural and social forces, echoing the original function of the mythic framework. The enduring influence of Slavic mythology extended into personal and social morality. Stories of gods, spirits, and mythic creatures often encoded lessons about respect, reciprocity, and ethical behavior. Mistreatment of the natural world, disregard for communal norms, or neglect of domestic duties could result in misfortune, while careful attention, generosity, and adherence to custom were rewarded. Even when these narratives were reframed within Christian contexts, the practical and moral guidance remained. Myths served as behavioral scaffolding, helping individuals navigate complex social environments and reinforcing community cohesion. The continued relevance of these lessons illustrates that mythology's endurance was not accidental. It was functional and adaptive, embedded in human experience rather than confined to theological doctrine. Oral storytelling was another crucial medium for the preservation of myth. Elders, storytellers, and community members passed narratives from one generation to the next, adapting details to reflect contemporary circumstances while retaining core themes. This adaptability ensured the survival of mythic structures even in contexts where formal belief had diminished. A story of Veles manipulating fate might become a cautionary tale about greed or cunning, a narrative lesson rather than a religious commandment. A Purin-like figure could be recast as a Christian saint associated with storms, preserving the narrative tension between chaos and order. Oral tradition allowed myth to remain dynamic, responsive, and culturally relevant, providing a framework for understanding human experience that persisted across centuries. The psychological function of these myths cannot be overstated. They provided mechanisms for coping with uncertainty, loss, and danger. The conclusion of Slavic mythology in the post-Christianization era is not a neat or tidy separation. It is not a moment when myth, religion, and belief simply dissipate or vanish, nor is it a clear-cut demarcation between the old and the new. Instead, the mythology of the ancient Slavs persisted subtly and powerfully through layers of adaptation, reinterpretation, and cultural integration. The shift from polytheistic practices rooted in gods, spirits, and the natural world to the Christian framework of a singular God and moral theology did not erase the essence of Slavic mythology. Rather, it transformed the way in which those ancient beliefs were expressed, understood, and practiced. One of the most striking aspects of the survival of Slavic mythology is the persistence of its themes and archetypes within folklore. These were the ancient stories that had once been sacred and tied to the land, the gods, and cosmic forces, but now, in the absence of formal worship, became transformed into folk tales and popular narratives. Purin, once a thunder god and symbol of divine power, could be found in stories of saints and heroes, not as a literal deity, but as a metaphor for the forces of nature and a human struggle to overcome chaos. Veles, the god of the underworld, transformed into figures of trickery or even moral challenges that tested a person's character. Even figures like Mokash, the goddess of fertility in the earth, could still be found in the nurturing, protective figures within folk narratives, though her identity was now associated with saints or angels rather than pagan deities. This process of transformation did not mean that these figures were forgotten, but instead allowed for their reintegration into a new religious and cultural system. Slavic mythology lived on through these reinterpreted characters, even as they shed their formal identity and function as gods. Their essence, their relationships with humans, and their roles in the world, whether as protectors, mediators, or tricksters, remain woven into the fabric of Slavic life, though now filtered to the lens of Christian values. The narratives remain powerful and relevant, but the specific theological explanations that had once grounded them in a polytheistic framework were replaced by new structures of belief. Another significant avenue for the survival of Slavic mythology was the integration of older practices and customs into Christian ritual and observance. Though the formal worship of Slavic gods was outlawed and supplanted by Christian rites, many of the customs surrounding seasonal festivals, community rituals, and domestic practices continued. The agricultural cycles, such as the spring planting, the summer solstice celebrations, and the autumn harvest, remain as integral parts of life in rural Slavic communities. These festivals often incorporated new Christian symbols, such as saints and crosses, but the core practices, lighting fires to mark transitions, offering food and drink to honor the harvest, and performing communal dances to celebrate abundance, remain the same. These rituals, once associated with gods and spirits, continue to fulfill a deep psychological and cultural function. They provided structure to the year, marked the passage of time, and reinforced a sense of connection between human life and the cycles of nature. Even as the names and theological meanings of the rituals shifted, the underlying need to honor the forces of nature and the rhythms of existence remained unchanged. The old gods, in a sense, continue to influence the lives of the Slavs through these celebrations, albeit now disguised as saints or symbolic acts under new religious order. The incorporation of Christian figures into folk customs further blurred the line between the old and the new. Many saints were linked to pre-Christian spirits or deities through their roles as protectors of specific natural elements, such as rivers, trees, or animals. In certain parts of Eastern Europe, Saint George, for example, became associated with dragon slaying, a motif that mirrored the earlier Slavic mythology of dragons, and serpents representing chaos and destruction. Similarly, Saint Nicholas, a beloved figure of Christian tradition, took on a protective role akin to that of household spirits, ensuring the safety and well-being of children. These figures did not replace the ancient spirits. They absorbed aspects of them, transforming old religious roles into new Christian forms. The saintly figures were positioned as intermediaries between the human world and divine forces, just as the old gods had been, offering protection, guidance, and blessings in exchange for respect, devotion, and ritual. This reimagining of sacred figures allowed Slavic communities to maintain a connection to their cultural roots while simultaneously adapting to the new religious landscape. It is a process of syncretism, where the old gods are not erased, but are integrated into a new religious framework that respects the existing cultural practices while redefining their meaning. Slavic mythology also continued to survive in the social and familial structures that were built on ancient beliefs.